In the town of Silver Creek, whispers labeled him a dangerous drifter. They judged his scarred German shepherd a monster. But in the quiet, before every dawn, a young waitress performed a silent act of kindness, leaving a hot breakfast by the back door, unaware the man was a Navy SEAL and his dog was a true war hero. And when darkness found her, that so-called monster would become her shield, and that drifter, her unwavering guardian. Before the story unfolds, tell us where you're watching from tonight. If this journey touches your soul, please subscribe for more stories of courage. A dense mist clung to the peaks encircling Silver Creek, a suffocating embrace. It was a sleepy town cradled deep within the Colorado Rockies, where winter refused to release its grip, and the air carried the constant taste of pine and impending snow. In that gray, uncertain hour, just before the sun broke through, Edward Miller began his daily ritual, his boots striking the frozen pavement with a precise rhythmic cadence, a military precision that echoed through the empty streets. At 34, Edward was a man who bore his years like a heavy pack, his build broad and forged in discipline. It was a physique honed by years of brutal discipline as a Navy SEAL, though he now moved with a certain rigidity, a testament to injuries that ran deeper than flesh. His dark hair was clipped short, all function over form, and his eyes, the cold gray of flint, were in a constant state of sweeping the perimeter, a reflex he could not shed even in this peaceful civilian haven. Beside him ran Gunnar, a colossal German shepherd, who was more shadow than beast in the pre-dawn gloom. Gunnar was no mere pet. He was a retired military working dog, a combat veteran in his own right. His history etched into the jagged scar across his flank, and a missing left ear that gave him a rugged, intimidating air. Together they were a pair of ghosts haunting the town's outer limits. The locals watched them from behind twitching curtains, their gazes a mixture of fear and suspicion. To the people of Silver Creek, Edward was simply the dangerous drifter who'd taken the old cabin at the edge of the woods, a man who spoke to no one, and whose dog looked as if it could rip a bear in two. They knew nothing of the medical leave or the long, sleepless nights, or the crushing silence that screamed louder than gunfire in Edward's ears. Their route always took them down Main Street past the darkened rows of closed shops, and the one traffic light pulsing a solitary yellow into the gloom, a path that always led them past Daisy's Diner, a time capsule from the 1950s, all gleaming chrome and humming neon where the warm scent of fresh coffee was already bleeding out into the cold morning air. For the past 2 weeks, this exact stretch of their run had presented an odd, inexplicable pattern each and every morning. Without fail, a small, pristine styrofoam container would be sitting on the concrete step by the kitchen's back door. Inside, the contents never varied 2 strips of crisp bacon and a mound of warm, fluffy scrambled eggs. Never a note. No name, just the offering. Edward's training had kicked in at first, his mind screaming paranoia as he checked it for poison for any sign of a trap. But Gunnar's primal hunger had scented something more, overriding Edward's tactical caution. The dog had devoured it that first morning, and looked up at Edward with eyes that for just a moment lost their hardened combat glaze. It had become their ritual. But today Edward was determined to break protocol. It was no longer about the food. He had to identify the source. He cut his run short, stopping a block out. He gave Gunnar a silent hand gesture to heel. The dog responded instantly, his body flush against Edward's leg, his single ear pivoting, sampling the wind. They moved without a sound into the alleyway beside the diner, melting into the shadows of the dumpster and the brick wall. As they waited, the cold began to cut through Edward's jacket, but he didn't so much as shiver. He just waited, a figure carved from patience and trauma. A few minutes later, the diner's heavy steel door protested with a loud creak. It threw a rectangle of warm, golden light onto the frost-kissed asphalt, and a young woman stepped out into the cold. Shivering against the biting air, she appeared to be about 24, her hair hastily pulled back in a messy style. Her hair was pulled into a practical bun that failed to tame the stray curls framing a face etched with weariness. but lit by an undeniable kindness clad in a faded blue waitress uniform. A white apron was tied at her waist, a canvas of the morning's coffee spills. This was Clara May, a constant presence in the diner. Though Edward did not yet know her name, she clutched the familiar white container, her gaze sweeping left, then right. Her breath formed a pale ghost in the air before she knelt, placing the food on the step, whispering, "Eat up, brave boy." She whispered into the void, her voice a fragile melody against the harsh morning, and Edward tensed, expecting Gunner's warning growl. Gunner harbored a deep-seated distrust of strangers, a remnant of his service where the unknown almost always meant a threat. He had lunged at a mailman only last week, but as Clara stood, Gunner made no sound, his body remaining calm and steady. Instead, the massive dog strode from the alley's shadows before Edward could give a command, and Edward's heart hammered against his ribs. His trained instinct to restrain his dog battled with a wave of confusion as he watched paralyzed Gunner trot directly to the waitress. Clara gasped, stumbling back a half-step. Her hand flew to her chest, but she didn't scream. Her eyes traced over the imposing animal, seeing the missing ear and the web of scars. Then slowly, a smile broke across her face, radiant enough to melt the very frost on the ground. "It's you," she breathed softly. Kneeling on the dirty pavement without a second thought, she said, "I knew you'd come early." Edward could only watch in absolute disbelief. Gunner the dog, who had tracked insurgents and sniffed out deadly explosives, lowered his head and nudged it gently into Clara's hand, his tail usually a rigid curve. Began a slow, rhythmic thump against the brick wall, a steady beat of trust. Thump, thump, thump. It was a sound Edward hadn't heard in years. Clara buried her hands deep in Gunner's thick fur, scratching him right behind his good ear. She murmured soft, comforting words as Edward finally stepped from the shadows, his boots crunching loudly on the frozen gravel. Clara looked up, her eyes widening at the towering figure emerging from the darkness, but she showed no sign of fear. She glanced from Gunner back to Edward, her smile not fading, but simply turning shy. "He's not a monster," she said. Her words answered the town's unspoken gossip before Edward had to. "He's just seen a lot of bad days." Edward looked down at his dog. Then he looked at the girl who had disarmed a weapon of war with a plate of eggs and an open heart, and for the first time since arriving in Silver Creek, the cold didn't feel quite so piercing. The brass bell on the door of Daisy's Diner jingled with a cheer that felt entirely out of place. As Edward Miller pushed inside, the diner's warmth struck him like a physical wall, a shocking shift from the biting, pine-scented frost of the alley. The sudden smell of frying bacon, old coffee, and stale smoke was jarring. He had left Gunner with a firm stay command. Just outside the glass door, the dog sat like a stone sentinel, his unblinking eyes fixed on Edward's back through the glass. As the heavy door clicked shut behind him, the low murmur of morning conversation in the diner was instantly severed. It was the classic small-town reaction to an outsider magnified by the rumors that had raced ahead of him. Every head in the place turned. The patrons were mostly older men in flannel and trucker hats, retirees who had claimed the vinyl booths as their personal kingdoms for decades. They held coffee mugs suspended in mid-air, their eyes narrowing under weathered brows, assessing the man who lived in the cabin by the woods. Edward ignored them, all his posture instinctively straightening into a state of defensive readiness as he walked toward the counter. His boots made a faint squeak on the checkered linoleum floor. Clara was behind the counter refilling a sugar dispenser when she looked up and saw him. Her eyes widened, a sudden warmth blooming on her pale cheeks. She was a different woman under the harsh fluorescent glare than she'd been in the forgiving gloom of dawn. Younger, perhaps, but with haunting shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of endless double shifts and too little sleep. Edward stopped directly in front of her, his hand reaching into the pocket of his heavy canvas jacket to pull out a crisp $20 bill. He placed it flat on the Formica counter. "For the food," he said, his voice a low gravel from disuse. "And for the last 2 weeks." Behind him, the diner remained deathly still, the tension thick enough to suffocate. Clara stared down at the money. Then her gaze lifted to his as she firmly shook her head, pushing the bill back toward him with a single fingertip. "I can't take that," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "It wasn't a transaction. It was a thank you." Edward's brow furrowed in a deep frown. "A thank you for what I haven't done anything?" Clara leaned forward ever so slightly. Her voice dropped to a whisper, a shield against the prying ears in the booths. "For his service," she said. She nodded toward the glass door, where Gunnar kept watch. "And yours?" Edward stiffened. "He's just a dog." Clara offered a sad, knowing smile. "No, he isn't. I saw the tattoo inside his ear," she whispered. "R214. My brother was a handler in the Marines. He told me they tattooed the service number right there in the left ear. I saw it when Gunnar let me scratch his head this morning." A genuine jolt of surprise shot through Edward. He had assumed she was just a soft-hearted girl feeding a stray, but she had been observing with an attention to detail that rivaled his own. She had seen the soldier behind the loyal beast. Before he could respond, the kitchen's swinging doors flew open, and a short, stout woman in her 60s marched out, wiping her hands on a stained apron. This was Mrs. Higgins, the owner of Daisy's Diner, a woman with a face that looked as if it were carved from granite. Deep lines were etched around a mouth that rarely smiled, and her gray hair was pulled into a severe bun so tight it seemed to pull at her temples. "Clara?" she barked, her voice grating like a rusty hinge. "Table 4 needs coffee, and you're standing here chatting like we're at some tea party." She glared at Edward with raw suspicion, before her eyes flickered down to the $20 bill on the counter. Then her gaze returned to the girl. "And take that trash out back later," she added with a grumble. Edward noticed she wasn't actually looking at the trash. She was looking past him to the dog standing vigil outside. Her grumbling tone lacked any real venom. She knew Clara was feeding the dog, and despite the scolding, she hadn't stopped it. This was a woman who guarded her heart as fiercely as her cash register. The atmosphere shifted from tense to volatile as the front door slammed open, letting a blast of cold air swirl through the diner. It was followed by a man who looked like he'd been worn down by bad choices and cheap whiskey. Buck was a local fixture Edward had seen stumbling around town before. He was a large man in his 40s, a beer gut straining against a dirty flannel shirt, his eyes bloodshot from a night that hadn't yet ended. He reeked of stale alcohol and pure aggression. "Coffee, sweetheart," Buck bellowed. Staggering toward the counter, he nearly knocked over a stool before slumping onto the seat next to Edward, ignoring him completely to leer at Clara. "And make it quick. I got a headache the size of Texas." Clara's entire demeanor changed in an instant. She shrank back, her shoulders hunching instinctively. "Coming right up, Buck," she said, her voice trembling just slightly as she moved to pour the coffee. But as she set the mug down, Buck's hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around her wrist like a trap. "You're looking real pretty today, Clara." He slurred, his grip tightening as she tried to pull free. "Why don't you smile for me? You never smile for me." The diner's quiet hum instantly turned to a frozen stillness. The old-timers in the booths suddenly found their plates fascinating, unwilling to meet the moment. But Mrs. Higgins, she took a brave step forward. Her mouth opened to cry out, but Edward was already in motion. No shout, no haymaker, just a silent, deliberate step into Buck's world. His movement was fluid, terrifyingly precise. "Let go," Edward said. It wasn't a request. His voice was a low rumble of command. It was a voice stripped of anger, yet heavy with an authority that seemed to charge the very air. Buck blinked his bleary eyes, struggling to focus on Edward. "Who the hell are you?" Buck sneered, trying to leverage his size to loom over him. "Get lost, bum." He refused to release Clara's wrist. Instead, his grip tightened, forcing a pained wince from her. Edward never blinked. With a speed that defied the eye, his hand shot out, seizing Buck's wrist, not the one imprisoning Clara, but his free one, using it for leverage, while expertly applying pressure to a nerve in the arm that held the girl all in one seamless movement. Edward twisted. It was a joint lock, a classic submission hold meant to neutralize, not to permanently injure. But the pain was instant, and it was blinding. Buck let out a high-pitched yelp of pure shock, his hand flying open, instantly freeing Clara. Edward drove him down, twisting the man's arm behind his back, until Buck's face was slammed against the cold laminate of the counter. "I said let go," Edward repeated. His tone remained eerily calm, as if commenting on the weather. Buck writhed, struggling against the hold, but Edward pinned him with almost no effort. His grip was like a vice of steel. "You are going to sit here," Edward stated, his voice calm, as he leaned close to Buck's ear. "You are going to drink your coffee in complete silence, and then you are going to leave. Do you understand me?" Sobering up fast under the sharp sting of pain and fear, Buck nodded frantically against the counter. Edward released him, then stepped away. Smoothing down his jacket, he watched Buck slump onto the stool, rubbing his shoulder, his face pale, and his eyes wide with stark terror. He wouldn't look at Clara. He wouldn't look at Edward. He just stared, trembling, into his coffee. The silence in the diner was absolute. It was no longer a silence of suspicion, but a heavy, suffocating silence born of awe and fear. Every single patron was staring at Edward. They were realizing this drifter was something far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. Clara rubbed her wrist, her wide eyes fixed on Edward, filled with shock, while Mrs. Higgins stood frozen, mouth agape, a dish rag clutched in her hand. Edward simply placed the $20 back on the counter. He turned and walked out the door without a single word, the little bell jingling with a false cheer behind him as he rejoined Gunnar in the cold. Sleep was a fugitive Edward Miller constantly chased, but could never seem to catch. The silence of his cabin, nestled on the edge of Silver Creek, often roared louder than a transport plane. It was a silence filled with the phantom echoes of battles fought in deserts thousands of miles from home. When the insomnia threatened to suffocate him, usually around 2 o'clock in the morning, Edward needed a mission. He needed a task to occupy his hands to quiet the storm in his mind. For the past week, that mission had shifted from patrolling the lonely perimeter of his own property to the quiet back alley of Daisy's diner. He could not accept charity. It violated every fiber of his being, went against the sacred code of self-reliance that had been drilled deep into him, until it was marrow deep in his bones. But Clara had refused his money, and Mrs. Higgins, for all her gruffness, hadn't run him off. So Edward chose to repay his debt with the only currency he had left: his labor and his protection. His work began with the small things, the little imperfections he'd noticed on his morning runs. A loose gutter rattling its lonely song in the wind, threatening to fall on a customer. A delivery door hinge that shrieked like a banshee whenever it was opened. A rotted board on the porch steps working in the dead of night, guided only by the silver moonlight reflecting off the snow-covered ground. Edward worked, moving with the silent efficiency of a phantom, his tools a humble collection he had brought along. He laid them out on a cloth to muffle their sound against the concrete, as Gunnar sat nearby, his silhouette merging with the dumpster's darkness. His ears pivoted like radar dishes tracking the movements of nocturnal creatures or any late-night wanderers. They were a team once more operating in the shadows, but this time they were building, not tearing down. The dynamic between the soldier, the dog, and the waitress evolved in the quiet space between night and dawn. It wasn't spoken, it was written in small gestures. One morning, beside Gunnar's usual container of eggs, Edward found a tall, insulated thermos with a yellow sticky note attached to its side. The handwriting looped cheerful. "Black no sugar for the night watchman. P.S. The delivery door doesn't scream anymore. Thank you." Edward drank the coffee in the alley. It was hot, strong, and bitter, exactly how he liked it. He didn't write a note in return, but the next night he repaired the flickering floodlight, the one that had been driving the neighbors crazy for months. The next morning, a dog treat shaped like a bone lay next to the thermos, and another note: "Gunnar is the best supervisor, stay warm." It was a silent conversation, a bridge built across the chasm of his isolation. Mrs. Higgins was a harder nut to crack. She never acknowledged him directly. However, on Thursday night, as Edward tightened the bolts on a wobbly handrail, the back door opened, He froze his hand, instinctively drifting toward his belt. But it was just the older woman. She didn't look at him. She walked out with a trash bag, dumped it in the bin, and stood there letting the cold air sting her face. She glanced at the fixed gutter, then the stabilized railing without turning her head toward the shadows. She spoke to the air where he stood. "That railing's been loose since '98. My husband meant to fix it before he passed. Never got around to it." She turned and went back inside the lock, clicking shut. The next night when Edward arrived for work, a heavy red metal box was sitting on the newly fixed step. It was an old toolbox, scratched but filled with high-quality, well-oiled tools. Wrenches, screwdrivers, a heavy hammer, and a voltage tester. It was a peace offering. It was permission. With the tacit approval from the owner, Edward turned his focus to the most critical vulnerability. He'd identified the security camera mounted high in the back porch corner. The device was a relic, completely covered in grime and rust. Its wire was severed years ago, likely by a storm or a past vandal. To anyone else, it was simply junk. To Edward, it was a blind spot in the perimeter. He set up the ladder from behind the shed gunner pacing below to keep watch. The wind was picking up, biting through his gloves, but Edward's hands remained steady as he disassembled the housing. He cleaned out the bird's nest and the corrosion on its contacts. It was a standalone unit, one that didn't need a complex internet uplink, which was fortunate as the diner's Wi-Fi barely reached the kitchen. He stripped the frayed ends of the power cable, splicing them with a spare wire he'd scavenged, sealing the connection with electrical tape to make it waterproof. The internal battery was dead, but the direct power line, once connected, the junction box hummed to life, and the tiny red LED on the camera blinked a single, watchful eye, opening in the darkness. But a live feed wasn't enough. He needed a permanent record. Edward pulled a small, high-capacity SD card from the depths of his pocket. It was one he'd purchased at a general store, 2 towns over, a deliberate choice to avoid any local questions. He carefully slotted it into the camera's storage port. He adjusted the angle with precision, ensuring its view covered the entire back entrance, the dumpster, and the dark approach from the alley. This wasn't just a simple repair, it was a tactical installation. He configured it to overwrite old footage only when full, guaranteeing a continuous loop of evidence. As he climbed back down the ladder, wiping grease from his hands, Edward glanced up at the solitary, blinking red light. It was nearly invisible to the untrained eye, lost in the deep shadows of the eaves. But to him, it was insurance. He didn't know what kind of threat could ever find its way to a place like Silver Creek, but harsh experience had taught him one thing: the world was never as safe as it appeared. He patted Gunner's flank, the big dog leaning into his touch, and for a moment the perimeter felt secure. Or at least as secure as one man and his loyal dog could ever make it. The blizzard descended upon Silver Creek, not as a gradual accumulation of snow, but as a sudden, violent erasure of the world itself. By early evening, the mountains had vanished behind a blinding curtain of white. As the wind screamed through the valley, it howled with a ferocity that rattled the very bones of the old buildings on Main Street, and the temperature plummeted, turning the very air to ice. And then, inevitably, the power grid surrendered. One moment the town was held in the warm, yellow glow of streetlights and living room windows. The next, the entire town was plunged into an abyssal, freezing darkness, a darkness broken only by the sweeping headlights of a few unfortunate vehicles still struggling on the treacherous roads. Inside Daisy's diner, Clara May stood frozen in the middle of the kitchen, a dish rag clutched tightly in her hand. The sudden deafening silence of the refrigerator's hum and the rattling ventilation fans was more unnerving than the storm itself. She was utterly alone. Mrs. Higgins had left an hour ago to secure her own home. She'd warned Clara to lock up early. Now Clara fumbled for her phone, its pale flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive dark. As she navigated the familiar maze of stainless steel tables, her heart pounding as the wind slammed a loose shutter against the siding. It sounded like a fist demanding entry. A few hundred yards away on the unplowed road winding behind the commercial district, a lifted pickup truck spun its tires uselessly in a drift that had formed with unnatural speed. Inside, 3 young locals were trapped. They represented the town's restless and privileged youth. In the driver's seat sat 19-year-old Tyler Vance, son of the town's wealthiest real estate developer. Tyler was handsome in a sharp-edged, arrogant way, wearing a varsity jacket that offered little protection from the brutal cold. His face was flushed with the artificial courage of cheap whiskey. Beside him sat Brad, a nervous, lanky kid who echoed everything Tyler said. And in the back, huddled and miserable, was Jessica, a quiet girl who just wanted to be home. We're stuck, Brad stammered. His eyes were fixed on the wall of white outside. My dad is gonna kill me. Tyler slammed his fist against the steering wheel. Relax, Tyler sneered. We just need to wait it out, or find a place to crash. He squinted through the windshield, and then he saw the faint outline of the diner's back entrance. Daisies? He said, a slow grin spreading across his face. Power's out. I'll bet old Higgins keeps a bottle of brandy in that office. And it's definitely warmer than this truck. The logic was fatally flawed, born of cheap booze and a lifetime of entitlement. A dangerous belief that the town existed solely for their convenience. They weren't hardened criminals, just bored, reckless kids who had never once been told no. One by one, they tumbled out of the truck into the storm. The wind howled, nearly sweeping them from their feet as they forged through knee-deep snow, pressing on from their cabin toward the diner's back porch. Outside, the storm was a furious roar, but inside it was the sudden, profound silence of his dog that put Edward on alert. Gunnar had been sleeping by the wood stove, but then he snapped awake, his head lifting sharply, his ears swiveling to pinpoint a threat beyond the storm. As he rose, a low rumble vibrating deep within his chest. It wasn't a growl, but something more primal, a warning. Edward, reading by candlelight, lowered his book and watched his dog with absolute focus. Gunnar paced to the door, whining with a desperate urgency, then looked back, his eyes burning with an intensity that communicated a silent tactical command. A perimeter breach. Edward never questioned the dog. Without a moment's hesitation, he seized his heavy coat and a powerful flashlight. He placed his faith in Gunnar's powerful nose over his own limited senses. The biting wind carried a jumble of scents, pine ice exhaust that told him nothing. But Gunnar detected something else entirely, the unmistakable scent of adrenaline, of raw fear, and the sharp metallic tang of aggression carried on the air. They moved as one into the heart of the storm. Edward struggling to stay upright as Gunnar carved a path through the snow, swift and certain as a wolf on the hunt. Tugging on an unseen leash, he led Edward directly toward the diner, just as the chaos was finally erupting inside. Clara's scream was swallowed by the sound of shattering glass as Tyler, enraged by the locked handle, acted on a surge of drunken frustration. He had taken a tire iron from his truck and smashed the pane. "It's an emergency!" Tyler yelled against the storm, reaching inside to work the deadbolt. "We're freezing to death out here." He forced the door open, stumbling into the kitchen's sanctuary, Brad and Jessica crowding right behind him as Clara backed away, her phone falling. The phone's flashlight beam danced wildly across the ceiling. "Get out of here," she cried, her voice trembling. "I am calling the cops." Tyler just laughed, a jagged, cruel sound that cut through the air. He hadn't planned on hurting her, but seeing her fear made him feel dangerously powerful. It was the kind of feeling he chased to forget how small he really was. "Relax, Clara," he sneered. "We just need to warm up, maybe have a little drink on the house." He took a step toward her, a hulking shadow in the gloom, his presence filling the confined space with menace, while Brad began rummaging through the pantry. The sound of cans crashing to the floor echoed in the stillness. "Tyler, maybe we should just go," Jessica whispered, but he completely ignored her. He shot his hand out, grabbing Clara's arm to stop her retreat. "Don't be like that, Clara." In that instant, the back door didn't just open, it exploded inward. It wasn't the wind. A black and tan blur launched itself through the opening with the force of a missile. Gunnar made no sound. He didn't waste the energy. He hit Tyler squarely in the chest. The impact so powerful it lifted the larger boy off his feet and slammed him violently onto the cold tile floor. Tyler screamed, his arm flying up to protect his throat by pure instinct, and Gunnar's jaws immediately clamped down hard on his forearm. It was a measured, crushing bite, expertly designed to incapacitate, not to kill. The sound, a wet, sickening crunch, cut right through the noise of the blizzard. A shriek of pure agony ripped from Tyler's throat, the tire iron clattering uselessly across the floor as Brad scrambled away, tripping over a crate of onions, while Jessica could only scream. Pressing herself against the wall, Edward appeared in the doorway, his flashlight beam cutting a path through the chaos like a blade. He absorbed the scene in a single glance, the shattered glass, the terrified waitress, the intruders. Then his voice cut through the noise. "Gunnar, house!" Edward's command cracked through the darkness like a whip. Gunnar released his hold in a heartbeat, but stood over Tyler, hackles rigid and teeth bared. A terrifying growl vibrated from deep in his throat. Tyler clutched his bleeding arm, sobbing like a child. "He bit me. He's insane." But Edward moved to Clara first, deliberately placing himself as a shield between her and the intruders. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice calm and low. His voice was low and steady. Unable to find words, she just shook her head, her hands gripping his jacket as Edward turned his light on the intruders, pinning them in the beam. "You broke in," he said, his voice void of emotion. We were freezing," Brad stammered from the floor, his face a ghostly white. "We just needed shelter, and that monster attacked us." In the distance, the mournful wail of sirens sliced through the wind's howl. A neighbor, perhaps, who heard the shattering glass or saw the frantic lights, had placed the call. Moments later, Deputy Vance Tyler's own uncle and Sheriff Brody burst through the front door. Beams from their flashlights cut through the dark, revealing a scene transformed. Jessica was helping Tyler to his feet, scarlet blood dripping from his arm, staining the immaculate floor. "Thank God you're here," Tyler cried out, leveling a trembling, blood-smeared finger at Edward. "Sheriff, arrest him. Our truck broke down, we just came for help. And that psycho turned his wolf on us. I swear he was just waiting for someone." The sheriff, a burly man with exhaustion etched on his face, glanced from his nephew's bleeding arm to the shattered glass of the back door, and finally to Edward. Edward stood stoic, the magnificent dog, a steady presence at his side. But the story was already taking root in the sheriff's mind, 3 frightened local kids versus a violent drifter with a lethal weapon. "Edward Miller," the sheriff's voice was low, his hand already resting on the butt of his sidearm. "T'goes. Get control of your animal and step away from the girl." The blizzard had passed, leaving Silver Creek buried beneath 2 feet of perfect, untouched snow, a blinding whiteness. But this tranquility was a lie. Though the winds were silent, a different kind of storm was gathering in the coffee shops and on the shoveled sidewalks of Main Street by 8 a.m. The truth of what happened at Daisy's Diner had already mutated, twisting from a desperate act of self-defense into something far more sinister. It was now a horror story of unprovoked violence starring Tyler Vance, who wore a dramatic sling and an expression of carefully crafted innocence. He held court at the general store, spinning a tale of how he and his friends narrowly escaped a crazed hermit and his wolf dog after merely seeking refuge from the bitter cold. Meanwhile, his father, Marcus Vance, a man who wielded his wealth like a club, was already at the sheriff's station. His voice echoed through the thin walls, demanding nothing less than justice, immediate arrest, and the destruction of the vicious animal that had savaged his boy. Marcus was a big man, soft around the middle, but with eyes as hard as granite, typically seen in tailored coats that cost more than the average car. He saw the town not as a community of people, but as a portfolio of assets to be managed. Sheriff Brody, looking even more drained than usual, rubbed his temples, listening to Marcus threaten to phone the governor himself if that madman wasn't locked up by noon. The pressure felt like a physical weight. In a small town like this, the truth was often drowned out by the one with the loudest voice. And in this valley, no one's voice was louder than Marcus Vance's. Edward, meanwhile, was back at the diner not to eat, but to repair the door he had been forced to shatter. He moved with a quiet precision, sweeping the slivers of glass that sparkled like cruel diamonds in the bright morning sun. His face was a stoic mask, but Clara, working at his side, couldn't hide her red-rimmed eyes raw from a night of tears and no sleep. She had tried to explain what truly happened, but the deputy had brushed her off, dismissing her words as hysteria or worse, a lie to protect her boyfriend. The insinuation made her blood boil. In the corner of the kitchen, Gunnar sat a calm and watchful guardian, his ears twitching at every sound from the street. The diner's air was thick with a silent dread. When new sirens sliced through the morning quiet, they didn't sound like help was coming. They sounded like a judge's gavel falling. 2 patrol cars pulled to the curb, followed by the stark white of an animal control van. It was a boxy truck with barred windows looking unnervingly like a cage on wheels. A small crowd buzzing with the morning's gossip began to form. They gathered on the sidewalk, their hushed whispers turning to a collective gasp as Sheriff Brody emerged, flanked by his deputies and a triumphant-looking Marcus Vance. Edward slowly set down his broom, wiped his hands on a rag, and walked out onto the porch to meet them. Gunnar moving in perfect sync at his left heel. He wasn't a criminal. He was a sentinel, a guardian standing his post as Sheriff Brody ascended the steps. His hand rested on his belt, not drawing his sidearm, but a clear signal of readiness. "Edward Miller," Brody called out. His voice carried a deliberate projection for the gathered crowd. "I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of assault with a deadly weapon and reckless endangerment. And I have a court order to seize the animal known as Gunnar for quarantine and behavioral evaluation." In that moment, Clara burst through the door. Her apron whipped in the biting wind. "You can't do this!" she shouted, her voice fracturing. "They broke into our home!" "Gunnar protected me, Tyler is lying." Marcus Vance pushed forward a cruel sneer, twisting his face. "Save it, sweetheart. My son has 40 stitches in his arm because this maniac trained a wolf to hunt people. That beast is going to be put down before it kills a child." A murmur of assent rippled through the crowd, fear overriding any sense of reason as an animal control officer watched on. The nervous young man clutching a catch pole moved toward the stairs. Gunnar let out a deep rumbling growl that vibrated through the very wood of the porch. The sound froze the officer in his tracks. Edward placed a calming hand on Gunnar's head, and the growl ceased instantly. He glanced at the catch pole. Then his eyes moved to Marcus Vance, and finally they locked with Sheriff Brody's. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout. He spoke with a chilling, absolute calm that sliced through the anxious noise of the crowd like a razor. "Sheriff, before you take another step, you need to understand exactly what you are doing." Edward declared, "This is not a pet. This is retired military working dog Gunnar service number R214. He is a decorated combat veteran who saved 12 Marines in Fallujah. He is considered legitimate military property on detached retired status." Edward stepped forward, his entire presence shifting from defensive to commanding. "If you seize him, you are legally responsible for his welfare. If you harm him, if you put him down without a federal hearing, you aren't just dealing with a dog bite case. You will be answering to the Department of the Navy and the Uniform Code of Military Justice. I will bury this town in so much federal litigation you won't be able to afford a single stop sign." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus Vance's face turned a shade of purple, but for the first time his expression was one of uncertainty. The sheriff blinked slowly, the immense weight of Edward's words sinking in. This was not some drifter ranting. This was a soldier issuing a tactical warning. "I'm just following the law, Miller," Brody said, though his voice had lost its earlier conviction. "The judge signed the order. The dog goes to quarantine. You go to the station. If what you're saying is true, you can prove it all in court. But for right now, you need to surrender." He motioned to his deputies. "Don't make this ugly." Edward's gaze fell to Gunnar. The dog looked up, his amber eyes filled with unwavering trust, awaiting the command to fight or to yield. It was the hardest decision Edward had faced since leaving the sandbox. If he fought, they would put Gunnar down. If he surrendered, he lost everything. He took a long, deep breath. The cold air filled his lungs and he made his choice. "Stand down, Gunnar," he whispered, his voice heavy with emotion. "Stand down." He looked at the animal control officer. "No pole. He walks with me to the truck." Edward walked Gunnar to the cage himself. The crowd parted for them as if they were radioactive. He signaled for the dog to enter the crate. Gunnar hesitated, letting out a single plaintive whine. It was a high-pitched sound of confusion that shattered Clara's heart, but he obeyed the hand signal. The metal door clanged shut. The sound echoed with a terrible finality. Edward turned and presented his wrists to the sheriff as the handcuffs clicked into place. Clara stood on the porch, tears streaming down her face, watching as the only two beings who had made her feel safe were led away by the people supposed to protect them. The silence blanketing Silver Creek that night was a crushing weight, a cold so deep it felt like it was freezing the truth beneath layers of ice and willful ignorance. At her small kitchen table, Clara May clutched a mug of tea. Long since gone cold, her gaze fixed on the empty chair where her cat should have been sleeping. The haunting image of Edward led away in chains, and Gunnar's bewildered, heart-shattering cry as the cage door crashed shut replayed endlessly in her mind. It was a living nightmare, and she felt utterly small, powerless against the suffocating influence of the Vance family. And the town, in its haste to judge, had already condemned Edward, painting him as a dangerous drifter, and Gunnar as a time bomb waiting to explode. But Clara's memory was unshakable. She knew the terror of that night, and she remembered the look in Tyler's eyes. They weren't filled with fear, but with a predatory hunger. She knew Gunnar hadn't attacked a defenseless boy, he had confronted a monster. Despair was a tide pulling her under until a spark of memory pierced the darkness she recalled the nights Edward spent working in the alley. The soft scrape of his tools, the silhouette of him on a ladder, tinkering with that rusted box beneath the eaves. And then she remembered a tiny blinking red light, a light she'd seen while taking out the trash, one that wasn't there before. A camera. Adrenaline shot through her veins. It banished her exhaustion. If Edward fixed that camera, if it was recording, it would hold everything. The break-in, the menacing threats, the truth itself. But the town's power grid was unreliable, flickering in and out, and the internet lines were dead buried under heavy snow. There was no way to access a cloud feed, even with a password. She had to get the physical storage, the memory card locked inside the device. Without hesitation, she threw on her coat, pulled on her boots, and grabbed a flashlight. The journey to the diner would be treacherous. The streets were slick sheets of black ice veiled by fresh snow. The wind gnawed at her face, but she forged ahead, driven by a desperate need to undo the damage. The damage her own helplessness had permitted. When she finally reached Daisy's diner, the building loomed dark and silent, like a ghost ship lost in the snow. She circled around to the back alley, the crime scene still sealed off by yellow police tape. The tape flapped mournfully in the wind. She ducked beneath it, her flashlight beam sweeping across the shattered glass that still covered the porch. And there it was, the camera, a dark sentinel high in the corner against the peeling white paint, impossibly out of reach. Clara hauled the heavy aluminum ladder from the shed, her boots skidding on the icy concrete. The metal was bone-chillingly cold, searing through her gloves as she wrestled it into place against the wall. The ground was a treacherous slope of frozen slush, making the ladder wobble dangerously. As she tried to set its feet, she glanced up. It was a long way down, and the wind was howling now, threatening to rip her from her perch. Taking a shaky breath, she gripped the rungs and started to climb. Each step was a war against gravity and her own fear as the ladder groaned beneath her. It shifted on the ice. Halfway up, a brutal gust of wind hit her, and she cried out, clinging to the ladder as her heart hammered against her ribs. "Don't look down, Clara," she whispered, her own voice a prayer. "Just get the card." She finally reached the top, her fingers numb and trembling as she fumbled with the camera's casing. It was rigid with cold, the screws frozen solid. She pulled a dime from her pocket, using it as a crude screwdriver, chipping at the stubborn ice. Panic flared in her throat as the ladder lurched an inch to the right, and then a sudden beam of light sliced through the darkness from below, blinding her. "You're gonna break your neck, girl!" a raspy voice called up from the ground. Clara froze, her blood running cold, caught by Deputy Vance or someone far worse. Shielding her eyes, she dared to look down. At the foot of the ladder, wearing a thick wool coat over a nightgown and heavy snow boots, stood Mrs. Higgins. And the old woman didn't look angry at all. She looked exhausted, her face a mirror of the same dread consuming Clara. But Mrs. Higgins didn't raise her voice. She gave no command to retreat. Instead, she advanced, setting her heavy boots deep and firm into the snow. Her gloved hand seized the ladder's base. "Well?" Mrs. Higgins barked, her breath forming a cloud in the frigid air. "Don't just cling there like a frozen ornament. Grab it before this wind takes us both down. I've got you." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, but she nodded, turning back to the camera. With Mrs. Higgins as her anchor, the terrifying sway ceased, and Clara finally forced the casing open. Nestled inside was a small black SD card. It seemed so insignificant, a mere sliver of plastic, yet it held the fate of 2 lives within its circuits. She ejected the card, clutching it like a lifeline in her gloved hand, and scrambled down the ladder with desperate speed. Once on solid ground, Clara fell back against the cold brick wall. Trembling as the adrenaline faded, Clara watched Mrs. Higgins release the ladder, her stern expression finally melting into something softer. "You think he got it on tape?" she asked, her voice still rough. "He records everything," Clara breathed, holding up the card. "He's a soldier, Mrs." Higgins nodded. "My office. The generator's on in the back. Let's see what those vicious little punks were really up to." They slipped inside, bolting the door behind them. The office was tight-thick with the smell of old paper and peppermint as Mrs. Higgins coaxed her ancient desktop to life. Its fan whirred like a struggling engine in the stillness. Clara slid the card into the reader, her hand trembling as it hovered over the mouse. She clicked on the file from the night before. A video player launched, flooding the screen with grainy black and white footage. There was no sound, but the image was painfully clear. They watched Tyler, Brad, and Jessica lurch toward the back door, saw Tyler wrench at the handle, then the shatter of glass as he used a tire iron, breaking and entering plain as day. They watched the trio stagger into the kitchen, and then the moment that changed everything. The footage captured Tyler backing Clara against the pantry, his hand plunging into his jacket pocket and emerging with not a phone, not a flask, a hunting knife with a 6-inch blade. He brandished it in Clara's face, a cruel laugh on his lips. The steel gleamed under the camera's infrared glow. The threat was absolute. This was never a plea for shelter. It was an armed attack, and then a blur of fur as Gunner launched into the frame. The dog didn't just maul. He targeted the arm holding the weapon. The bite was surgical, precise, disarming the threat in a heartbeat. Tyler dropped the knife, his scream a silent hole in the footage. Edward materialized just seconds later, securing the scene. Mrs. Higgins let out a long, low whistle of disbelief. "That boy didn't just break in," she seethed, her eyes like chips of flint. "He came at you with a lethal weapon, and that dog saved your life." Clara finally broke, sobbing with a tidal wave of relief and horror. They had the proof. They had everything. And come morning, the town of Silver Creek was headed for a reckoning. The town hall itself was a building that reeked of floor wax. And stale bureaucracy, a place where tedious disputes and budget meetings normally suffocated the very air within its walls. But tonight, the air crackled with a volatile energy, less a civic assembly and more a modern-day witch hunt. Every seat was taken, the crowd spilling along the back walls, their faces flushed with a righteous fury expertly fanned by Marcus Vance. At the front, behind a long oak table, the town council squirmed, visibly uncomfortable under the unified glare of the people they served. Off to the side, Seated on a cold metal folding chair, his hands cuffed before him, was Edward Miller. He sat with a profound stillness that unnerved the onlookers. His spine straight, his gaze locked on some distant point, utterly ignoring the venomous whispers and hostile stares. He wasn't a prisoner. He was a monument of stone weathering a storm of lies without a tremor. At the podium, Marcus Vance began his assault. His voice thundered, a wild hand jabbing toward Edward. "We cannot let this danger fester in our town," Marcus roared, sweat beading under the harsh lights. "My boy is lying in a hospital bed because this man unleashed a weapon of war here," he seethed. A vicious, untrained beast that savaged a child just looking for warmth. "We must sign this expulsion order now, and that animal must be put down before it takes another life." The crowd rumbled its assent. It was a low, ugly rumble, fear disguised as righteousness. As the mayor's hand closed on the gavel, the great doors at the back of the hall crashed open. The crack echoed like a gunshot, freezing the room in a stunned silence. In the doorway, breathless, stood Clara May. Her hair was a mess from the wind, her coat dusted with snow. Beside her, Mrs. Higgins clutched a laptop to her chest as if it were a shield. "Stop!" Clara's voice, though trembling, soared to the rafters. "You're lying. All of you are lying," Marcus Vance sneered, leaning into the microphone. "Somebody get this hysterical girl out of here. This is official town business." But Clara held her ground, then marched down the center aisle, her boots striking the hardwood floor, pushing past the hands that tried to stop her. "I have proof," she declared, her eyes locked on the mayor. "We have the diner's security footage. Edward didn't attack anyone. Gunnar didn't attack anyone. They saved my life." A wave of confusion washed over the assembled crowd. The mayor, a careful man who'd long distrusted Marcus Vance's brand of bluster, lowered his gavel. "If there's evidence, we'll see it," he ruled. Mrs. Higgins moved forward confidently, plugging a cable into the side of her laptop. She connected it to the town's projector. The screen behind the council table flickered, and the entire room fell into a dead, expectant silence. As the grainy black and white footage flickered on, they saw the raging storm. Then they saw Tyler Vance, clear as day, shattering the glass door. They watched the group stumble in, and then a collective gasp stole the breath from the room as Tyler pulled a hunting knife from inside his coat. On the giant screen, the blade seemed immense, the intent behind it undeniable. This wasn't a scared boy looking for shelter. It was an armed predator cornering a woman. When Gunnar launched into the frame, the story was completely rewritten. It wasn't an attack. It was a rescue. The dog's precision targeting only the arm with the weapon, releasing the instant he was told it was the work of a professional, not a wild animal. The video froze on the final image, Edward standing guard over the intruder, a calm, protective presence. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the hall. At the podium, the color drained from Marcus Vance's face. His mouth worked open and closed like a fish gasping for air. He had no words, no defense. The lie was exposed for the whole town to witness. Before the whispers could swell into a roar of outrage, Sheriff Brody rose from his seat near Edward. He'd been silent the entire night. In his hand was a thick manila folder faxed to him just an hour before. He walked to the center of the room, his boots echoing in the stillness. He didn't look at Marcus. He looked at the faces in the crowd, his own expression grim. "I've heard a lot of talk tonight about drifters, and vagrants and dangerous men." Brody continued, his voice thick with emotion. "So I did my job. I ran Edward Miller's fingerprints through the federal database. It took some time to get a response because his file is flagged with the highest security clearance." He opened the folder, pulling out a single sheet of paper. "This man isn't a drifter. He is Commander Edward Miller, United States Navy SEALs." A shockwave tore through the room as Brody kept reading from the file. "Commander Miller is a veteran of 6 combat tours. He's been awarded the Silver Star and 2 Purple Hearts, and the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in combat." Brody's eyes scanned the room, his gaze landing hard on the very people who had cast insults at Edward. "The Navy Cross is the second highest military honor this country bestows. He earned it by holding a position alone for 12 hours. Then against an enemy force of over 100, refusing to be evacuated until every single one of his men was safe. Brody then turned to Edward, the sheriff, a Gulf War veteran who knew all too well the price of that brand of heroism straightened his spine. He walked to the folding chair with a heavy, deliberate slowness. He pulled the keys from his belt and unlocked the cuffs, the metal clattering loudly on the floor. Brody didn't move. Instead, he snapped his heels together, stood at rigid attention, and raised his hand in a sharp, crisp salute. "Commander," Brody said, his voice thick with reverence. "I am sorry. This town is sorry." Edward rose slowly, rubbing his raw wrists. He looked from the sheriff to the silent crowd, his face not triumphant, but just tired. He returned the salute, a simple, clean motion. "I just want my dog, Sheriff," Edward said quietly. The shame in the room was a physical weight. Men stared down at their shoes, women covered their mouths. They had painted a hero as a villain, and the weight of their judgment hung heavy in the air. The mayor banged his gavel, but gently this time. "Charges dismissed," he declared, his voice trembling. "Release the dog immediately, and Mr. Vance, sit down." The doors to a side office opened, and a deputy led Gunner out. The dog wasn't aggressive at all. He was scanning the room, searching for one face. The moment he saw Edward, a bark of pure joy ripped through the silence as he strained against the leash. Edward dropped to one knee, ignoring the crowd, the politics, and the tears welling in Clara's eyes. He opened his arms, and 80 pounds of German Shepherd slammed into him, licking his face, whining and burying his head in his human's chest. Edward buried his face in his dog's fur, his shoulders shaking with silent emotion. It was the reunion of two soldiers who had walked through hell and back, finding their only true peace in one another. Clara watched them, her heart swelling with a powerful mix of relief and pride, knowing that Silver Creek would never be the same. They tried to break a man forged of steel, and in the end it was their own hardness that shattered, revealing the undeniable truth underneath. The snows had finally begun to melt, exposing the dormant, brown earth of Silver Creek beneath the winter's heavy shroud. It had been 3 weeks since the town meeting, and the valley's atmosphere had shifted as dramatically as the season. The suspicion that once followed Edward Miller like a shadow had evaporated, replaced by a clumsy and often overwhelming gratitude. People who had once crossed the street to avoid him now waved from their porches or stopped him to shake his hand in the grocery store. The for sale sign on the old Henderson property, a dilapidated 60-acre farm just 2 miles down the road from Daisy's Diner, had been collecting rust for over a decade. The barn was leaning precariously to the left. The fences were rotted away, and the main house was a mere skeleton of peeling paint and broken windows. To anyone else, it was a money pit. To Edward, it looked like a second chance. He stood by the gate, the deed in his pocket, looking out across the overgrown fields. He hadn't planned to put down roots. The original plan was just to drift, to keep moving, until the noise in his head finally went silent. But as he looked down at Gunner, who was happily sniffing a patch of thawing mud, Edward realized the noise had already stopped. The silence was no longer a void, but a sanctuary of peace. For the first time in years, he wasn't on the run. He was planting roots. The revival of the Henderson farm soon became a town's mission, though Edward never once asked for help. It began with Mrs. Higgins arriving one dawn with a truck piled high with lumber, and her 2 strong nephew's men who knew their way around a roof frame. "Can't have a Navy commander freezing in a drafty old house," she'd grumbled, pressing a hammer into his hand. Soon after, the local carpenter came. The same man from the back of the town hall, now offering to mend the barn doors for only the cost of materials. Even Sheriff Brody stopped by on his days off, swapping his badge for a tool belt to help restore the perimeter fence. Edward accepted their help not with pride, but with a quiet, humble gratitude. He understood this was their way of making things right. He wasn't just rebuilding a farm, he was rebuilding his faith in humanity, one nail at a time. The work gave him a mission beyond mere survival. He began to see the farm as more than just a home, but as a true sanctuary. He knew there were others out there just like him, men and women, who returned from the dust of war, their bodies whole but their spirits shattered. Warriors who no longer fit into the simple shapes of civilian life. He had the land, he had the understanding, and he had the most powerful healers of all dogs. By late spring, the K9 and Warrior Reintegration Center opened its gates. It was no sterile clinic of white walls and buzzing lights. It was a haven of dirt sweat and wood smoke. The first group of veterans arrived in May, a collection of Army Rangers, Marines, and infantrymen, each one shouldering the unseen burdens of trauma. They were cautious at first, their eyes sweeping the tree line just as Edward's had. But then they met Gunnar, the magnificent German Shepherd. He became the heart of the center, its lead therapist. He just knew instinctively who was fighting a silent battle, resting his heavy head on a trembling knee, or just sitting in solidarity with a man lost in a 1,000-yard stare. It was here that Edward taught them how to train the dogs, how to transform their hypervigilance into unwavering focus to communicate without ever shouting. He showed them that a dog sees no rank, and it doesn't see the nightmares. It only knows the here and now. Watching a former sniper truly smile for the first time in months while playing fetch with a rescue Labrador, Edward felt a tightness in his own soul finally give way. And Clara May, she became the lifeblood of the entire operation. She worked at the diner all week, but every weekend the sound of her small car on the gravel driveway was a promise. She had never worn a uniform, but she had a strength all her own. A bright, unyielding resilience that smoothed the rough-hewn edges of the farm and its men. She commanded the office, taming the chaos of paperwork, coordinating with veteran charities, and managing the schedules. She brought life back to the land, planting wildflowers that climbed the fence line and hanging curtains in the main house. She became the bridge between these warriors and the very world they had fought to protect. One Saturday afternoon, she found him in the barn, breathing new life into an old workbench. He paused as she entered, wiping a streak of sawdust from his brow. "You know you don't have to spend your weekends here," he said, though the very thought of her absence left the barn feeling cavernous and cold. Clara simply picked up a piece of sandpaper. "I know," she replied softly. "But Gunnar would miss me. And besides, someone needs to make sure you remember to eat." Her smile was the same one that had calmed a frightened dog in a dark alley, all those months ago, full of unwavering kindness. In that moment, Edward truly saw her and realized she had rescued him just as profoundly as Gunnar had. The summit of their journey wasn't marked by fanfare, but by a quiet moment that felt like a blessing. It was early autumn, and the air held that crisp, nostalgic bite that signals the coming winter. Edward woke before dawn, a reflex he'd never lose, but for the first time his hand didn't reach for a weapon. He brewed a pot of coffee, its rich aroma filling the restored kitchen of their farmhouse, as he poured 2 mugs and stepped out onto the wide, wraparound porch he'd just finished last week. Gunnar padded behind him, his nails tapping a soft rhythm on the new wood before settling onto a rug by the rocking chairs. The sky above was a canvas of deep indigo bleeding into violet and gold as the sun began to crest the jagged peaks of the Rockies. A fresh dusting of snow had painted the mountaintops a brilliant white against the morning sky. The screen door creaked, and Clara stepped out. She was wrapped in a thick knitted blanket, clutching her own mug. She didn't speak, just came to stand beside him, a silent comfort. Leaning together against the railing, they watched the light pour into the valley, illuminating the very training fields where they'd found their purpose. The mended barn and the gentle curl of smoke from the bunkhouse chimney, where 3 veterans were finally sleeping in peace. This was a sanctuary built from broken pieces, now mended stronger than ever. Edward took a sip of coffee, the warmth a welcome reassurance in his chest. He looked at Gunnar, sleeping peacefully with his belly exposed, a testament to absolute trust. He looked at Clara, her face awash in the golden light of the sunrise. Her eyes were serene and full of joy. He then gazed at the town of Silver Creek in the distance, no longer a hostile territory, but a community he belonged to. The crushing isolation that had defined his life for so long was gone, replaced by a belonging so profound it was both terrifying and magnificent. "It's a beautiful morning," Clara whispered, her voice still warm and thick with sleep. Edward reached over, covering her hand on the rail with his. His was rough and scarred a map of his past. Hers was smaller, softer, but unwavering. "Yeah." Edward breathed, his own voice heavy with emotion. "It really is." He drew a deep breath of the cold, crisp mountain air. "I used to think I left my home on the other side of the world," he said, his gaze fixed on the peaks. "But I think I was just waiting to build this one." Gunnar let out a contented sigh in his sleep, his tail giving a single lazy thump against the floorboards. The soldier, the woman, and their loyal dog stood together in the quiet light of a new dawn. Home. At long last. If this story of resilience and love moved your heart, we ask you to share it with someone who needs a beacon of hope in their life. Please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more stories that are sure to lift your spirit and nourish your soul. May God bless you with the courage of a warrior and the gentle heart of a friend. May He watch over you and protect your home and guide you to be a light in the darkness for others. If you believe in the power of kindness and God's amazing grace, please type Amen in the comments below. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Stay blessed